As the State Department declares Britain an unsafe place for practitioners of free speech, Vice President Vance, holidaying in the Cotswolds, has convened a veritable round table of the British right in the English countryside. Will this have an impact on our domestic politics, while the Labour government continues to plunge us into anarcho-tyranny? Speaking of which, who are the British police protecting? It seems in the last week that there are a number of videos of black criminals assaulting and terrorising law-abiding members of the British host majority, and when brave Englishmen and women step in, they are the ones who are punished. No wonder this is turning every Zoomer with a camera phone into a radical who prefers strong men over the sclerotic parliamentary democracy that has betrayed the British electorate time and time again. All that and more this week on Tomlinson Talks. So American Vice President and noted Anglophile JD Vance is holidaying in the Cotswolds in the last week. You can see him here meeting and mogging the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, living proof that there's a village somewhere deprived of his idiot. It's quite funny, actually. Vance and his kids caught lots of fish, whereas David Lammy didn't, and it seems that he might have even broken the law, because in this joke of a country you need a fishing license to get your tackle out and go and catch some fish. You know, on reflection, that sounded like an innuendo, didn't it? Anyway, so Vance wasn't met with overwhelming praise with people on the left, because a bunch of Soros-funded astroturfed protests showed up. They decided to, well, use notably homemade signs this time, I think because they recognised that the Stand Up to Racism renter mob wasn't exactly looking the most organic when they were recycling their pre-printed placards from 2020. But of course, the same middle-class boomer leftists who live very far from the consequences of the policies they support, like infinity number of Muslim refugees being stockpiled in Leeds, Luton, Leicester, Bradford, London, take your pick. They are off in the Cotswolds, where it is overwhelmingly white English, yet they're still obsessed with Palestine for some reason, despite the population there being very happy to decapitate a lot of them. And then they decided to, and this is Zoe Gardner here, put Vance's face from that one meme that he finds really funny on a Colin the Caterpillar cake. Again, very telling that they get most of their protest sustenance from Marks & Spencer's, very middle-class supermarket. Nice place, but still very upmarket and progressive. Zoe Gardner, as Charlotte Gill points out, went on a activist boot camp, something called Neon, which is actually funded by the Soros Open Society Foundation. So she is just another astroturf leftist who gets platformed by the BBC and Sky to tell us why borders are racist and why we should destroy our own countries. Thank you very much, you subversive communists. Also, they drove a giant van around the Cotswolds with this meme of Vance's face on it, and they put it up on a big billboard. Again, Vance finds this funny. This is the exact same tactic, by the way, that patriotic millionaires use. They use the same vans to drive around London, patriotic millionaires, another Soros-funded group, to say, hey, we're actually really wealthy, but the wealthy should pay even more in tax. Bear in mind, you're more than welcome to make a voluntary donation to HMRC. Instead, you're just trying to manufacture consent for progressive policies that end up inflicting ridiculous amounts of costs on young professionals so that they can't buy a home, start a family, and those who have the means to leave, which is why we've lost 16,500 millionaires in the last year, and that is more than any other country, including China. So Britain is going seriously badly in terms of its economics, but also in terms of its civil liberties. And this is something that the State Department have noticed. I have spoken to good chaps in the State Department. They are our guys this time, after they've just fired a bunch of ideologues that were attached like barnacles to the permanent bureaucracy who left behind posters saying, remember, those behind are fighting fascism. It's like, oh, sorry. I don't think there's a single member of the Trump administration who sleeps with a copy of Giovanni Gentili and Benito Mussolini's Doctrine of Fascism under their pillow every night. But they have produced a report on human rights practices and abuses in the UK, and it's worth going through because this is how the Americans are starting to see us. Britain is becoming a pariah state, and I wouldn't be shocked if soon they start accepting free speech refugees from the UK and the rest of the Anglosphere, given Australia, Canada, New Zealand are all following the UK like lemmings off a cliff. I wouldn't be shocked if America starts taking in hordes of people from the motherland, you know, actual native Brits, who are being persecuted by our own government, because if you do the acceptable form of protest, like these middle-class, pro-Palestine, pro-migrant people are, you are funded by the government if you do an unacceptable form of protest, for example, complaining about Islam, mass immigration, grooming gangs, illegal migrant sex criminals, or just liberal progressive excesses like abortion and assisted dying, well, then the government come down on you like a ton of bricks and treat you like a terrorist. They've even got a new counter-terror unit that was established in 2017 to monitor ISIS posts, now dedicated to monitoring anti-migrant sentiment online. So let's see what the US State Department think of the UK. And I read this report, and I'm slightly critical of it because it actually understates how bad things are, but I appreciate that at least some of the people in the State Department have an eye on the way that we are just being taken advantage of and exploited by our own government and their foreign client groups. So, executive summary, the human rights situation worsened in the United Kingdom during the year. Just definitive, opening, damning. Significant human rights issues included credible reports of serious restrictions on freedom of expression, including enforcement of or threat of criminal or civil laws in order to limit expression, and crimes, violence, or threats of violence motivated by anti-Semitism. Now, we'll get to the anti-Semitism section later. I understand this is a priority for the Trump administration. That is a value-neutral analysis. That is just, they've made it very clear. There was a scandal, I think, about a week ago where the Trump administration were trying to tie FEMA disaster relief into whether or not a state had engaged in boycott, divest, and sanction practices against Israel, and they quickly undid that. But it does show you that the combating of anti-Semitism globally and domestically, and the staunch support of Israel is a key priority for the administration, and so it's factored in here. I would much rather a focus on anti-native, anti-white racism, because that is written into our laws, whereas anti-Semitism, even though it goes on de facto in Britain, and there are thousands of Jews leaving, there are synagogues closing that are being converted into mosques, historic Jewish areas like Golders Green are being emptied out, and you can't get a salt bagel anywhere for love nor money. Even though that is the case, it is not written into law that Jews are penalised. So this is a de facto level of discrimination, but it's both de facto and de jure that white Britons are treated like second-class citizens in their own country. And I think that should have got some more attention in this report. Anyway, it says, the government sometimes took credible steps to identify and punish officials who committed human rights abuses, but prosecution and punishment for such abuses was inconsistent. Well, it's totally absent in all of the officials who assisted in the cover-up of the Pakistani grooming gang scandal for decades. We know from Dominic Cummings that there were officials in the previous Blair and Brown, but also Cameron and onwards administration, civil service, who at the Department of Education knew of the grooming gangs and instead tried to take out injunctions against people like Andrew Norfolk, who tried to report them. We know the Home Office was funding communist groups like Hope Not Hate, not to just do their sort of dirty work, undercover policing, sting investigations for them on the far right, again, defined as readers of Douglas Murray and cultural nationalists, but also they were writing hit pieces on sitting MPs and people like Tommy Robinson for raising awareness about the grooming gangs. Again, you don't have to back or like any of these individual people to know that the government were working to proactively gaslight the population to hold a positive opinion of Islam and immigrants, even though there were known thousands of victims of these gangs. And so nobody has lost their job for that. Lots of people were promoted in spite of being involved in the cover-up, and nobody has been prosecuted for misconduct in public office about it. So, starts at section 1, life. Extrajudicial killings. There were no reports the government or its agents committed arbitrary or unlawful killings. Untrue, Peter Lynch. Peter Lynch, being the 61-year-old grandfather who was imprisoned for peaceful protest outside a migrant hotel in Rotherham during the post-Southport protests and riots, who, thanks to a heart condition and presumably fearing for his life in prisons that are controlled by a gang called the Muslim Brotherhood, he seems to have hanged himself in his cell. And he would not have been there in the first place if the state, as directed by Keir Starmer, the head of public prosecutions as well, had not gone after all of the protesters and put them on remand for a very long time, given them state-funded legal advice, which the Free Speech Union believed to be of poor quality, to strong-arm them into pleading guilty to incitement to racial hatred charges, and imprisoning them for 2 years while unleashing violent criminals onto our streets in waves of early release to apparently ease overcrowding, to lock up people like Peter Lynch or Wayne O'Rourke or Judy Sweeney or Lucy Connolly or a number of other people imprisoned after the protests and riots. And they do actually mention that in here in this report, but they don't link it to Lynch, so that's something that's been missed. B. Coercion in population control. There were no reports of involuntary sterilisation on the part of the government authorities. Untrue. Thousands of children being sterilised at the Tavistock clinic, despite the executives at the clinic knowing full well that the side effects from puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones were irreversible, worsened female adolescent mental health. They knew of the high referral rates for children in care who had parents who were registered sex offenders, who had up to 5 comorbidities like eating disorders and autism. They knew all of this, and they continued on with it anyway because of a commitment to gender ideology. So again, I feel like that qualifies, and it's missed a trick here. Section 2. Liberty. Freedom of the press. The law generally provided for freedom of speech, including for members of the press and other media, and the government generally respected this right, though there were specific areas of concern, including involving restrictions on political speech deemed hateful or offensive, as well as speech within public spaces protection orders areas, allowing local councils to limit speech rights within designated areas, and safe access zones limiting speech rights around abortion clinics. Right. The law generally provided for freedom of speech. If it does not provide for freedom of speech in all cases, it doesn't provide for freedom of speech, because freedom of speech is itself a freedom to speak. If you curb our ability to speak, it's a binary between freedom of speech and censorship. So again, I disagree with this, but I appreciate them pointing out that there were limits on hateful or offensive speech under the Public Order Act 1986, under the Malicious Communications Act 1988, under the Communications Act 2003, and under the Online Safety Act 2023 that's just come into effect, where over 12,000 people are arrested every year for posts online, and even more for posts or speech made in public. And then they, of course, mention the abortion buffer zones, where the likes of Isabel Vaughan Spruce or Adam Smith Connor or Livy Tosiki Bolt have been arrested and prosecuted for praying silently in their head or holding signs offering conversations to consenting adults about abortions and either praying for the murdered unborn children or telling mothers there is another choice to murdering your child. There was also the passage of this in Scotland, and it got to the absurd position where a Scottish minister said, I think it was on BBC Radio, that if you were seen praying silently in your head in your own house and you happen to live within the vicinity of a buffer zone, you could be prosecuted. There's also the dwelling defence has been dismantled, the dwelling defence being that you can't be prosecuted for things you say inside your own home. The dwelling defence was not only dismantled by the Scottish hate crime bill that Hamza Yusuf brought forward and brought into effect on the 1st of April 2024, ironically, but also the dwelling defence has been dismantled by non-crime hate incidents. In 2014, the hate crime operational guidance implemented after the 1999 Macpherson report, which accused the Met Police of being institutionally racist, without any evidence, by the way. It was proper Stalinist show trial where police had to confess to the private racist thoughts of other police officers. Anyway, after the hate crime operational guidance was brought forward, the police, in order to defend themselves against charges of racism, started recording non-crime hate incidents, so complaints of offence by someone with a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, basically anyone who isn't a straight white Christian male. They started recording them against members of the public, not informing them that this was on their permanent record, that it could show up on a DBS check, an advanced background check, prohibit them from public sector employment, and the police were discouraged from engaging in secondary victimisation, which meant asking the offended person for evidence. Also, the person who was accused of a non-crime hate incident couldn't face their accuser because they had to be protected, because their identity was that of a protected characteristic, so the police were just going around branding people with scarlet letters. And even after Suella Braverman, while Home Secretary, tried to legislate against this, the effect was actually that they increased in the number that were recorded, that the dwelling defence was dismantled, so you could get a non-crime hate incident for something said inside your own home, and now new Home Secretary Yvette Cooper wants to increase recording them for anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes. You would think that the two would contradict, given the hadiths about what happens on Judgment Day to the Jews, but cognitive dissonance is not something that bothers our ruling elite, is it? Next one. The law prohibited expressions of hatred towards persons because of their colour, race, nationality, including citizenship, ethnic or national origin, religion, or sexual orientation, as well as any communication that was deemed threatening or abusive and was intended to harass, alarm, or distress a person. The penalties for such speech included fines, imprisonment, or both. There were laws in the United Kingdom that restricted freedom of speech in certain areas or allowed councils to establish areas with restrictions on freedom of speech. Yes, we do not have a First Amendment. Now, of course, lots of these censorious ideological practices were imported back from American college campuses, the progressive movement of the 60s, the sort of new left at Berkeley, and the practices of Silicon Valley after the Trump election in 2016. Remember everyone at Google weeping and holding an emergency meeting with all of their staff. We remember the likes of Twitter's Trust and Safety Team infested with federal agents who were selectively discriminating against certain users. There were the backdoor access that the Biden administration had to the likes of Facebook and Twitter during COVID, where they could target things like Anthony Fauci parody accounts with barely any followers to take them down and control the narrative around masking, vaccines, and lockdowns. So this happens, again, de facto in America, but it is de jure and getting way worse in the UK. And so, again, I wouldn't be shocked if there were State Department extending, in exceptional circumstances, free speech refugee visas to people in the UK to evacuate them from the governments that are persecuting them, just as they evacuated a number of white South Africans being targeted by their racist government in South Africa. They also mention the law authorised UK authorities, including the Office of Communications Ofcom, to monitor all forms of communication for speech they deemed illegal. The Online Safety Act of 2023, which came into force in 2024, defined the category of online harm and expressly expanded Ofcom's authority to include American media and technology firms with a substantial number of British users, regardless of whether they had a corporate presence in the UK. Basically, the Americans don't like the fact that our government has just appointed the broadcast regulator, who, like Cthulhu always swims left, as the arbiter of what American platforms are allowed to host. And this means that the speech restrictions may not be region locked and they may affect American citizens as well. And also American citizens' ability to see content that is posted from within our country. So this impacts Americans' free speech rights. And so Keir Starmer was lying to Donald Trump's face at Turnberry when he said twice, in response to questions, we aren't censoring anyone. He was just straight up lying. And it mentions here, on April 1st, the Scottish Government implemented the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act, including the introduction of offences stirring up hatred through threatening or abusive behaviour and the communication of threatening or abusive material. What they didn't mention is that it got thousands of reports on day one. So not only is this costing loads of money, but it's an entire farce, and all of these crimes, shouldn't be crimes, are perception-based and ripe for abuse. It's a lot like how in Pakistan, if you have annoyed a rival clan, they will just levy a charge of blasphemy against you, which cannot be disproven, and you will be locked up in prison, tortured, and probably put to death, just so they can acquire your assets and land while you languish in prison for offending Muhammad or something. Muhammad being their prophet, not just one of the millions of people named after him, because they're not all that creative, of course. We go on to the workers' rights bit. I want to highlight this just because this is about unions and collective bargaining. What it doesn't mention here is the workers' rights bill being advanced by Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, which makes employers liable for things said in their establishment. So, for example, if a bar staff server is offended by a conversation they overhear in the pub, they can sue their boss. And so the boss then is responsible for anything said in their pub, which means that pubs themselves are going to have to censor patrons. So that should be mentioned in there. Next time this sort of thing is revised, just recommend anyone who might be listening from Washington, D.C. to take note of that and mention it next time. Then there's about forced or compulsory labour. I mean, I would personally say that all of my taxes being taken at the highest rate since 1948 and spent on the 4-star hotel fees for foreign criminals and sex offenders who are breaking into our country by the thousands, as well as millions spent on refugee households. I think it's actually 7 billion every year that's spent on universal credit. Hundreds of thousands of migrants, I think it's 1/5 actually of foreign nationals are on universal credit. I would say all of that's forced labour because I'm working, they're not, my money's going to them. But there you go. There was also a section here as well on disappearance and abduction. Disappearance, again, no reports of enforced disappearances by or on behalf of government authorities. Untrue. There are police officers participating in the Pakistani grooming gangs that are trafficking, murdering, and vanishing girls all over the country, between 50 towns and cities. The government and state officials have known this has been going on for decades. They are operating at rates higher than ever in history because of mass migration. And we know from the Casey report that illegal migrants are now participating in this. We know that there are grooming gangs in London. Even the BBC's admitted this. But Sadiq Khan is playing dumb, acting like he doesn't even know what they are. And we haven't identified any active grooming gangs in London yet, which doesn't make sense considering the high concentration of a Muslim population, large volume of migration there in the last few years, high population density, and yet we haven't identified or prosecuted any grooming gangs in London. Very suspicious. So yet there are state-sanctioned disappearances going on. It's just not the kind of journalists being abducted off the street and shot in prison or starved to death or poisoned that you would see in Russia, for example. Also, I think probably Peter Lynch goes under this category here. Prolonged detention without charges. Now, this is a very important bit as well. The law prohibited arbitrary arrest and detention and provided for the right of any person to challenge the lawfulness of their arrest or detention in court. Not in effect. Again, lots of people arrested during the post-Southport protests and riots that were put on remand and told, if you plead guilty, you'll be home by Christmas. Given false legal advice, they then pled guilty to offences they didn't actually commit and have now been given longer prison sentences than actual sex offenders. So this is another problem that has not been addressed yet. There's also a bit on child marriage in here, where it's down here. It's under child labour. Child marriage. There we go. It says the minimum legal age for marriage was 16. In England, Northern Ireland and Wales, persons younger than 18 required the written consent of parents or guardians, and the underage person was required to present a birth certificate. That's all well and good. However, we do have the highest number of Sharia courts in all of Europe. There's upwards of 90 that have been identified by the Times this year that we know are operating. If you don't think there's an epidemic of Islamic child marriage going on in this country, especially with brides being brought over, then I don't know what to tell you. There's multiple bridges that I can sell you. This is absolutely happening. There needs to be some sort of journalistic investigation into this. I hope one is underway. You never know who's doing what in this country at the moment before it's reported. But there is definitely child marriage happening in the UK in the self-governing Islamic enclaves, and more attention needs to be paid to this. Especially, I know they haven't done their violations in freedom of religion report yet, but there needs to be a massive section on the undue influence of Islam, not only over British politics, but the operation of a parallel legal and cultural system taking root in this country and giving privilege by the government over Christianity and common law. Also, provisions of first asylum. In England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the law provided for the granting of asylum or refugee status, and except for Bermuda, the governments had systems for providing protection to refugees. Yes, too generous. I mean, I think it's about 2/3 of all refugee applications are given grants, and even those who are rejected get a second appeal and get to stay in the country indefinitely due to the massive human rights infrastructure of which Keir Starmer was a key contributor, because he wrote the textbook in 1998 on how to apply the Human Rights Act, allowing these inveterate traitors of human rights lawyers to endlessly petition to keep foreign criminals in the country. It notes as well, following the UK's general election in July, the incoming Labour Party government reversed the plans of the Conservative government to transfer asylum seekers to Rwanda under the Safety of Rwanda Act. They did, and don't get me wrong, the Safety of Rwanda deportation and detention scheme was basically a glorified exchange program, because for every one illegal immigrant that we would send over to Rwanda, and we would pay for their bed and board the entire time they were in Rwanda, we would get a Rwandan national to come over to the UK for health tourism. So, absolutely terrible idea. However, it shows that the Labour Party aren't interested in even presenting any kind of deterrent. They have negotiated some sort of Potemkin deterrent plan with Albania earlier in the year, but it didn't come to fruition. They just want to be seen to be doing something, because the purpose of the system is what it does, and the British system imports thousands of foreign criminals and houses them at our expense, because fundamentally, if they don't repeal the laws to remove them from the country, well, you can only presume that the government and the civil service want them here. But it should be noted that after the Rwanda deportation scheme was scrapped, 50,000 illegal migrants have come over since Keir Starmer took power, and 2025 has been the worst year for recorded channel crossings, and we're only just over halfway through it. So this is a major problem. It is, as a scale, not nearly as bad as the southern border was during Joe Biden, where you had at least 12 million recorded illegal migrants crossing in the span of 4 years. But remember, we have a giant geographical moat surrounding our country, and yet we are getting millions of people flying in every single day via the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, and many are overstaying their visas, many are being harboured in houses of multiple occupancy, and also we have thousands of fighting age males who we have known have been sex offenders, terrorists, jihadists, murderers, coming over via small boats or smuggling themselves into lorries and also being housed at our expense and working illegally. So even though we don't have a southern border that's as porous as America's, or before the Trump administration took over, we are still getting the same level of legal migration that Americans get every year, but we are the size of New York State. And a lot of our legal migration is coming from the third world, which presents not just problems of economic unsustainability or cultural compatibility, but serious security concerns and an increase in crime. So I think a lot of that should be considered under here too. And then we get to the final part, which is acts of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incitement. And look, again, I understand this is a key concern for the Trump administration. However, the Jews leaving the UK should be the second order concern of what is causing them to leave, which is mass Islamic migration. Now, other kinds of migration are also a problem. I don't want Sikhs petitioning for Khalistan, or the Hindus rioting anytime India loses a cricket match, or African Christians sacrificing children to witchcraft. None of those people should be here. We need net negative migration. We need to reverse the Boris wave. We need to deport every single illegal migrant and foreign criminal in this country, no matter their nation or ethnicity of origin. However, the reason the Jews are leaving is because of mass Islamic migration. And this is the same reason that Israel is cutting security ties with the UK. It says here, as reported by The Times, that it's because Starmer's recognising Palestine. It isn't. What it is, you know, MI5 and MI6 have had diversity, equity and inclusion schemes for quite some time. You know, the Home Office, as I've described on my channel before, and with interviews with Andrew Gold, have an Islamic network who run counter-terrorism and even large parts of their immigration policy. Well, the Israelis know that our security services are packed to the rafters with Islamic activists and jihadist sympathizers. And so they don't think it's intelligent to share their intelligence with the UK security services because they're not populated by British nationals. Now, this is a very important image. So Tom Skinner, of course, is considering a run for London Mayor, whether as an independent or as a Conservative candidate has yet to be seen, but JD Vance followed Tom Skinner quite a while ago on Twitter. Grok actually pointed this out to everyone when Tom Skinner said, "Who's the most famous person that has interacted with my account?" And Grok said it was JD Vance. I know that Tom Skinner was very keen to have a chat with JD Vance, and this was a reciprocal interest from both parties, and so now that JD Vance is in the UK for a brief stint, they decided to have a beer and a barbecue. This was facilitated by our mutual friend, actually, James Orr, who has been a longtime friend and mentor of JD Vance. So there are good people working in the UK to try to bring political change, and it's good that, well, JD Vance is riding around the English countryside like a reverse Paul Revere and mustering the Rohirrim, as it were, to come to our defence. You know, Gondor calls for aid, and Rohan has answered. This has, of course, brought out all of the mentally ill online communists to descend upon Thomas Skinner and say, Thomas Skinner will be Prime Minister by 2035 unless someone does something. Ever wanted to get your name in the history books? Ever wanted to make a difference in life, a real difference? Ever wanted millions to know your name? Your time is now. Right, so just openly threatening him. And saying, oh, no, I absolutely meant that, you know, we should take him for a pint or two and discuss the works of Kropotkin and Engels. No, you didn't. You've got some weird gooning online avatar, so I think you're probably a demented Redditor who spends way too much time on the general websites and actually not enough time reading your own Marxist theory, because if you did, you'd realise it's totally bogus and just a way for resentful mutants to try and kill all of their political enemies en masse. And Mr. Skinner, if you're upsetting individuals like this, you're doing something right. There's some more details here in this report in the Times. Basically, Vance had breakfast with Nigel Farage on Wednesday morning. He then met with George Osborne, the former Chancellor from the Cameron government, in the garden of Dean Manor. And he also met with Robert Jenrick, who is currently the Shadow Justice Secretary, but of course is the favourite to take over the Conservative Party from Kemi Badenoch, who is cratering in the polls and whose allies are abandoning her like rats leaving a sinking ship. Vance didn't meet with Kemi. Both teams cited a scheduling conflict. So what was Kemi doing that was way more important than meeting the Vice President of the United States at a summit of the collective British right? She was serving ice cream in the Isle of Wight. I mean, everyone knew when Vance was coming over for his holiday. It's not like the teams couldn't have been talking. I suspect, actually, Vance himself wasn't that bothered about meeting Kemi because he knows, with his keen eye kept on British politics, that her career is not long for this world and she could be voted out as early as November, replaced with Robert Jenrick. This is also very interesting. Visitors also included Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, who has just been out in France with Jenrick, getting threatened with machetes by our imminent new arrivals, the GDP rocket fuel that is awaiting us in the camps of Calais. Laura Trott, who is the Shadow Education Secretary. Katie Lamb, who is the pantsuit deportations in chief Home Office Minister, who is doing a fantastic job on social media and on podcasts. And, of course, she was a former Home Office advisor. And Sir Paul Marshall, owner of GB News, The Spectator, and Unheard. Yes, the same Paul Marshall who is Winston Marshall's dad, the same Paul Marshall who helped runs ARC. He is trying to be a power broker on the right. He has previously backed Kemi Badenoch. He is the man who installed Michael Gove as the head of The Spectator. Michael Gove, whose first action when running The Spectator was to support Kamala Harris in the US election. So I think this is an exercise in trying to redeem the reputation and repair relationships with that particular faction of the Tory party, with the ascendant American right and the likely next president of the United States, especially because they're anticipating Labour to be voted out next time, and they're hoping for, at least at the moment, a Reform Conservative pact with the Conservatives led by Robert Jenrick. And so this is kind of a rapprochement to try to foster ties for when JD Vance becomes president in 2028, God willing, and also as of at least 2029, when Labour are voted out and we get our next government. A combination of Reform, the Conservatives, or just one of them, of course, hence why Vance met with them. And the reason Vance is so interested, as one ally of the Vice President says, he takes a close interest in British politics, not in a broad brush way. You'd be taken aback by how granular his grip is. It's beyond the international headlines. And I think the fact that we have mutuals on X means that he's probably reading the right people. So the American State Department, the Vice President, and probably the President himself, if he gets the time, has an eye on the UK, the human rights abuses and excesses that are being committed here. I don't even like the phrase human rights, actually. They're trampling over the historic customs and liberties that the English believe themselves to be entitled to, and quite rightly so. We, the British people, are being penalised and exploited by our own government for the benefit of hostile criminal foreign nationals, and the entire enterprise needs to end. And so we're grateful that the Americans are paying attention, and we can't wait until you step in with something more substantive. Back when I appeared on Trigonometry in March of 2024, I told Constantine Kissin and Francis Foster that there will be no Gen Z moderates. They're vanishingly rare and hard to find. Instead, with Zoomers, you have to pick your preferred flavour of revolution, whether it's woke communism or right-wing reactionary traditionalist revival. And the latter category is mainly spearheaded by young, particularly white Christian men, because they are, of course, the public enemy number one of the ruling woke hegemony. Now, at the last American election in 2024, the gender divide did not manifest as broadly as was feared, because it turns out there are lots of very sensible, good-looking, intelligent young women who don't hate men and who don't make their sole political issue the ability to abort a child up until birth, and so the gender divide is not as big as the New York Times and Kamala Harris had prophesized and hoped. However, the divide between boomers and zoomers on what is considered politically moderate or within the acceptable parameters of established political doctrines, basically the different flavours of liberalism that fought against Soviet communism during the Cold War and was acceptable following the Nazi, fascist, and communist atrocities of the Second World War, that paradigm is waning. The dead hand is being lifted from the consciousnesses of the latest generation, who are the furthest from the fading light of the 20th century. And I based my predictions at the time on this 2022 polling by Onward. It's from a study called The Kids Aren't Alright, the 4 factors driving a dangerous detachment from democracy. Now, they say dangerous. I don't think that's the case, because there's some embellishment in here that Gen Z just want a dictator. Now, bear in mind, we didn't get an ethnic breakdown for a lot of this data, so how much of the increasingly diverse Gen Z being polled are Muslims and want a caliphate? Not determined. However, when they say dictator, what they really mean, in the polling here, in the question, is having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections. That doesn't make him a dictator in the 20th century sense. That could make him an emergency appointed Caesar figure, per the Roman Republic, who in times of great crisis, like Cincinnatus, puts down his plough and takes up an office of state, and then, or like George Washington, relinquishes that power when the crisis has been averted. And I think, given now we've got more in common focus group sessions where, Gary, sales manager from Bournemouth, is saying we need a coup d'etat, we need a Cromwell to get in there and sort these politicians out and make them accountable to the people. What I think is driving this attraction towards military intervention, saying putting the army in charge, or a kind of authoritative Caesar figure coming to power, is a frustration with the political processes, a recognition that during COVID, the government can control all of the economy and private life by convening a press conference and just declaring it so, meaning that if the government fails to act, that is a decision by the government not to act, rather than some principled constraint or function of the system putting limits on the scope and ability of their powers. And also, it is seeing that actually voting doesn't do very much, right? It is seeing that, time and time again, the British electorate have expressed their desire to see mass immigration prevented, the mass demographic experiment inflicted upon us that we voted against in every single election and referendum since 1974 reversed, that foreign criminals should be sent home. Every time we express this desire in the Brexit referendum or successive general elections, we're just ignored, we're gaslit, and we're told we're doing something about it while the numbers continue to increase and quality of life gets worse. And so, it's not necessarily that people hate voting. It's not necessarily that people hate a democratic system. It is instead the kind of Aristotelian recognition that the only thing dividing any given system between democracy and mob rule, between aristocracy and oligarchy, between monarchy or strongmen and tyranny, is the virtue of the leaders. And our leaders are morally depraved, treacherous, cowardly, and quite stupid. And so we'd much rather someone capable step in and clean this mess up. And this is a pattern which is repeated across the political divides among Zoomers. So this is the poll that was conducted at the start of this year as part of a Channel 4 program, and the Independents say more than half of Gen Z want the UK to become a dictatorship. But yet again, the question was, the UK would be a better place if the army was in charge, or a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections was in charge. That doesn't mean a dictator. I mean, let's say that this person got in, they cleaned up the mess, and they ran for election again. Do we think that they would be elected? Like Nayib Bukele, for example, who enjoys a 90% approval rating and got over 85% of the vote at the last election because he went from El Salvador being a place controlled entirely by demonic MS-13 gangs to incarcerating all the criminals and allowing his population, no matter how poor and developing they may remain, to live in relative peace and enjoy a greater level of prosperity than before Bukele took power. Of course, people would prefer a Bukele figure to Keir Starmer being the civil service in a badly fitting suit, administering over the anarcho-tyranny which favours foreign criminals over tax-paying, law-abiding British nationals that we are suffering from now. And so you get to this new polling by the Adam Smith Institute, as tweeted out by Emma Schubart here, and she does some very good threads, so you should go and follow her. She has criminally few followers on Twitter at the moment, only 500. But she says, in the latest ASI polling, a third of Brits, 18 to 30, so mainly Zoomers, say they prefer an authoritarian system if it meant faster decisions. Again, people don't want, as she points out, a dictator. necessarily. They just want someone who has executive authority, a sovereign, to come in, take charge, make decisions, and actually listen to what the people want. Because generally speaking, the British public do have a modicum of common sense. I mean, because of Britain's unique family structure, its Christian ethos, religion that was a lot more explicit in the past, but still underwrites all of our common law traditions and customs, because of the 1,000 years of history and habit, common sense does actually reside in a large portion of the British public. They want migration reduced, they want a general sense of fairness, they want criminals punished, they're in favour of the death penalty for paedophiles, rapists, terrorists, and murderers. They would like taxes to be substantively lower. They still think that there's a place for a welfare state, but I think that they could probably be convinced that charitable enterprises and institutions, the kinds that were run by philanthropists in Victorian Britain at the kind of zenith of our civilization, could take over those roles and provide based on relationships between people, which means that you have to extend to other people moral consideration rather than just going to the state, no matter what your lifestyle choices are, I deserve a human right to healthcare and benefits. That's not very fair, is it? But the British public generally agree with all of those sentiments. They're quite sensible. And so what they want is not necessarily a dictator. They want someone without the liberal trappings that prevent them from exercising power, and instead who defer to antiquated and punitive laws that were put in place for a wholly different set of political conditions after the Second World War, which causes us to continually admit foreign criminals who exploit our generous asylum system and demand that the police give them special protections because they are from minority characteristic backgrounds. The British public don't like that very much. They want someone with executive authority to come in, scrap those laws, deport those criminals, and make Britain a peaceful and prosperous place, which it was back before 1945. And so if you look at a lot of the polling, it says here that a majority of them are still democratic, but only a slim majority, about 20% are indifferent or don't know, and a third of them prefer authoritarianism. So if you add the indifferent and don't know, it means that the majority of young people are not ideologically wedded to democracy as presented to them, mainly because democracy is a total sham. Our establishment have, again, inflicted mass migration on us. They have entered numerous wars of regime change without any popular mandate from the public. One of the largest protests in Britain, for example, was in 2003 when millions turned out on the streets to protest against the Iraq War, and we got involved in Libya and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Ukraine anyway. So our government just do not respect the mandate of the people, and instead they would rather someone who has more power but is more attentive to our concerns. It's why England has always been happy with a king, despite the fact that under liberal ideologies they would say this person is not elected, they're not democratically accountable, therefore their rule is illegitimate. No, the legitimacy rests in how attentive they are to the needs of their subjects and their countrymen, rather than whether or not they are voted in and hypothetically accountable, even if, while in office, they betray you anyway. And you get Hobson's choice between which party will betray you the next time it comes to vote them in or out. And so Emma does point this out, that among young voters, only 34% of Labour, 39% of Conservative, but 50% of Reform voters say they prefer an authoritarian system. And what this means is they want a system disruptor. This is what Reform codes as, even if they're currently not, right? They code as a hand grenade, a Molotov cocktail, as Michael Moore once said of Donald Trump, thrown at an inattentive establishment. They want someone to get in there and mess the system up because the system does not serve them, and it's almost gleeful in the horrors that it inflicts upon us. So they would quite like Nigel Farage and Reform to be that strong man, to be that disruptor. Whether or not they live up to their potential, the mandate afforded to them by the electorate, is a different question. But those with the least to benefit from a system have the least to lose by breaking that system apart. And when the system is illegitimate, unjust, and unsustainable, then you do need a system disruptor. And that's why they're saying, we would quite want that. And this is why you're getting this argument on BBC Newsnight, a kind of conversation that was unthinkable to platform quite some time ago. Poppy Coburn, who used to work for New Culture Forum, but is now at the Telegraph, she's arguing with Baroness Chakrabarti, who is a human rights lawyer. I think she's Bangladeshi ethnically, so she could actually get Bangladeshi citizenship if she wanted. But we used to work for the Blair government. She argues with Poppy Coburn over whether or not we should leave the European Convention on Human Rights, abolish the Human Rights Act, and leave the UN Refugee Convention in order to deport all of these foreign criminals that keep coming over, either overstaying their visas or smuggling themselves aboard small boats and lorries from Calais to break into Britain and be housed at our expense. And Chakrabarti, being wedded to the post-war Blairite paradigm, says it's absolutely unthinkable that we would leave these laws even if they are not functioning for the British people. And that is because she believes in a universal standard human for whom an all-encompassing, rationally divined political system can be made to be fit for governing all people. And this is the project of international institutions like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the European Union. These post-democratic institutions are actually appointing themselves to be the true arbiters of democracy, because by presuming everyone to be exactly the same underneath, that all geographic, cultural, and economic differences are easily remedied by the intervention by a liberal state, they are instead acting on behalf of everyone's true equal self-interest, and so it's properly democratic, because if you were allowed to vote for this, you would all vote for it if you didn't have the false consciousness of inequality, because deep down we're all blank slates, we all believe the same thing, and so we should all want the same type of government. And instead, Gen Z, having grown up in a very diverse society, having never known a high-trust, homogenous and prosperous Britain from before Tony Blair, and to a large extent Margaret Thatcher and all of her Conservative successors ruined it, we have nothing to lose by noticing differences and just saying, actually no, these laws don't work, this paradigm has exhausted itself, its contradictions are being made manifest in the daily injustices that we, the British public, have to suffer every day, and so we can just scrap it and replace it with something else. And it is totally unthinkable for the globalist drones like Chakrabarti, or the One Nation Conservatives, or Keir Starmer, to envision a future where there aren't laws that are ostensibly independent, governing all men, because every single human being is equal and the same. Instead, we are happy to act in the national interest, and we are happy to step outside the bounds of liberal international law in order to get things done. And as much as they might scream and whine and say, that's not a country I'd feel very comfortable about living in, well, one, you can move. Two, I think just based on demographics, you're going to get a Zoomer revolution anyway, whether you like it or not. If you ever question the legitimacy of claims that Britain has a two-tier justice and policing system, just ask, who do the state think the real victim is? So we'll start with Sadiq Khan's post that he put out about 4 days ago now, of the new crime data in London, and he says we've got 19% lower knife crime, 10% lower residential burglary, 13% lower theft from the person, and 13% lower personal robbery. Now, these three crimes, in particular the property crimes, are being reported less, and they are being solved a lot less. The majority of police forces in 2023 to 2024 didn't solve a single burglary. So no wonder people are reporting these less. But notice the number of crimes that Sadiq Khan leaves out here. And I asked the question, which of course was not answered because Sadiq Khan did not actually turn his comments on under this, but I asked, who's committing the crimes, Sadiq? Well, first of all, what crimes did he leave out? So the BBC reports, figures show fall in some crime, says London Mayor. Note some crime. So while he says that knife crime dropped by 19% between April and June this year compared to the same period last year, however, some offences such as possession of weapons, rape, and drug trafficking all increased in that period. Overall recorded crime has increased by 31.5% in the Metropolitan Police area of London in the last 10 years, with violent crime increasing by 40% according to official crime data. So, rape is up, there's one reported every hour in London, and who is committing these? Turns out it's the much cited diversity being our strength that Sadiq Khan loves, because 47% of sex offence charges in London last year were foreign nationals. This is up to because 7% have unknown nationality, which means that if their nationality was not determined to be British, then their nationality itself would be foreign, and that does not account for second-generation immigrants who themselves are British nationals, or recent immigrants who have been given indefinite leave to remain and applied for the expedited citizenship grants. So over 50% of sex crimes committed in London, committed every hour, by the way, are from people who never needed to be in this country in the first place. They were brought here as a consequence of government policy. They're allowed to stay as a consequence of government policy. So all of these sexual offences were committed as a consequence of government policy. They should all be gone, sent home. Meanwhile, Sadiq Khan thinks that these people, not white families, represent London, according to his advertising mandates. As well, in the last week, if you look at My London's reporting, there have been 4 stabbings, 1 shooting, fatal shooting, and a daylight rape among crimes in London. Said rape happened just down the road from me, it turns out, in Bexley. So, yeah, even in more homogenous areas of London, this sort of thing is just randomly happening because we have now got strange foreign criminals walking our streets at all times, and you don't know whether or not your wife, daughter, friend, sister, or mother is safe. And then you've got things like this. So here's a naked, I don't know whether he's second generation or first generation, African man who is told repeatedly to put his trousers on because he is flashing, with his meat and 2 veg out, a bunch of women and children on the tube, and a bunch of English lads on video step in and say, "Put your trousers on, mate, put your trousers on," and they're just given the sort of dead-eyed vacant stare of this rather demented man, and then I won't play the rest of this because they end up kicking him into submission until the tube stops, and then when the tube doors open, they detain him on the tracks. You will get more of this vigilante action the more demented criminals you unleash on our streets. You have not only let them out by giving early release to violent and sexual offenders, the Labour government did, in 2 rounds of early release in order to make more space to lock up people like Peter Lynch and Lucy Connolly for social media posts and peaceful protest, but also you are just importing people from regions of the world where not only rates of mental illness and schizophrenia are way higher than in the Western world, because we have much lower rates of cousin marriage, but also they hold barbaric beliefs about the value of women and children being relative to the pleasure sought by the most violent and domineering man. And it's not even medieval beliefs, because medieval Britain had a higher average age of marriage, it allowed women to own and inherit property, and it had violent punishments for men who beat and abuse their wives. But there is no concept, for example, of marital rape in Islam. And I don't know where this chap has come from. He seems to just be a deranged lunatic and sexual pervert, but a lot of the sex offences being committed by, especially illegal migrants, are men from Muslim countries. And so there is not just a values conflict here, there's not just an intelligence conflict here with lower levels of IQ and impulse control, there's not just a mental health conflict here, but there is a conflict between the native host majority, who are detaining these criminals, and the criminals themselves, who are of non-native ethnic background. And that's relevant because, one, again, every single one of them is in the country as a result of government policy. They didn't need to be here committing these crimes. Everything in this scenario is a choice, and we could choose for this not to happen. But also because the ethnicity is relevant to our ruling institutions, because they think that the man on the floor here, because he is black, despite being a sexual pervert, is the victim. And so anti-racist policing and reporting and government policies will privilege him over the white English people who are restraining them to keep them away from women and children. And we know this because this was reported by My London, the same outlet that reported all of these rapes and shootings and robberies, as half-naked man in mental health crisis beaten by London Underground passengers. Police then arrested the man before he was detained under the Mental Health Act. So they think that this man here, is the victim, not the women and children on the tube exposed to his genitals. Who wrote this? Well, as Peter Lloyd points out, it's a white female leftist. I don't understand this mentality that leads these women to extend pathological compassion to foreign perverts who are more likely to prey on them than anyone else. And it's no wonder that a large number of women are now regarding immigration as a women's safety issue, because they and children are the most likely to be targeted by these kinds of unvetted perverts. However, My London reports it very differently when it's a white bloke. Now, to be clear, I think both of these men should be hung. I think both of them are absolute degenerates. I think that if you expose yourself or attempt to gratify yourself in a public place, you should be flogged and deported at least. However, notice how it's reported. Police hunt man who touched and exposed himself on London Underground with a photo of the man, when he is white, presumably English, versus a stock photo of the tube and depicting the pervert in question as half-naked man in mental health crisis. Very strange, isn't it? Almost like there's a two-tier system going on here, as reported by those who uphold it through a misguided sense of pathological compassion, or, for many of them, just outright anti-white hatred. And so, the police are now hunting these men in question. They're describing them as tube vigilantes in this article, but they want to arrest these men for assaulting the sexual pervert and basically making a citizen's arrest. So they think that you defending yourself and children from perverts on public transport is the problem, rather than the perverts themselves. The pervert is getting a nice comfy hospital bed and presumably ice cream at bedtime. But these men are now subject to a nationwide manhunt by the Met Police. Just unacceptable. Also, there was another instance. So, do you remember the Britannia Hotel? You know, the one where we were told that there were no such illegal migrants being brought there and the protests were for nothing? Well, they've just bussed in another 50 of them in the dead of night the other day. This was on Thursday. So they are battery farming, foreign criminals at our expense in unanimous jumpsuits and giving them all sorts of amenities, including brand new phones. And the security guards as well seem to be of the same diaspora. So we've got migrants guarding illegal migrants, both at taxpayers' expense, and keeping them safe from the English people, the mothers and the children, who are most likely to be affected by this, peacefully protesting for their removal, the law being upheld. Well, one of them decided to just walk straight into a woman's house. So he went into this woman's house, and then another group of Englishmen followed him, and they called the police, and he was told by the police to go back to the hotel. They did not arrest him. Instead, they arrested the woman whose house he broke into. I mean, this is just insane.
This man in this vehicle has just entered a lady's property without her consent, and these officers have said it's not an offence. They're letting him go. They're letting him go. Officer, how is that not an offence? How is it not an offence entering someone's house?
That poor lady,
regardless, she didn't want him in the house.
Is alarm fear and discretion offence? Is alarm fear and discretion offence? Is she not alarmed even in fear?
You're letting him go.
Let him go.
So apparently trespassing isn't an arrestable offence. Just walking into someone's house, complete stranger, illegal immigrant because he's being housed in the hotel, that's not an offence. The police don't think that this individual is dangerous. This guy. I mean, we've seen this look before. This is just identical to Axel Rudikabana's mugshot, isn't it? This is the face of, you are not a legitimate authority. I hate you because you are trying to stop me from meeting my impulses and needs. There is no morality running through his head. It is just pure animalistic rage and a desire for self-gratification. And these are the people that we are admitting en masse and being forced to pay for. I mean, this face is as close as modern therapeutic morality would allow you to understand demonic possession. Right? And there are just thousands of these men currently sitting in this hotel. And we're paying for all of them. Absolutely all of them. And so, the police arrested the woman. So he walked straight into her flat, and they arrested the woman, and the charges, I mean, don't get me wrong, she seems to have done some things wrong by possessing some cannabis, but the charges were for assault on one of the hotel staff, as in one of the security guards guarding the migrant who followed her into her home. So the police are protecting not just this, but also the kind of palace guards who are ensuring that these foreign criminals are housed in luxury accommodation at the English taxpayers' expense. And so the Met decided to try and justify this, by the way. Jack Hadfield, who has been recording from the ground of all these protests. We did a deprogrammed with him on the New Culture Forum the other day. He's a good man. Jack had been sent this image. This was after this chap in question had been detained and released by police. He's just wandering around the neighbourhood in the same clothes. The following day. You know? Told to go back to the hotel. The guards that were put there to ensure that he stays and lives there, just let him walk out. Around the neighbourhood where families are. No problem. But the Met Police decided to defend their decision to arrest the woman by saying, "We understand a man entered a property through an open door, having been followed by a group of men in the street. The man has not been arrested at this time, as our initial investigation has not identified any offences. We understand this is distressing for the occupants. In a separate incident following this, a 22-year-old woman was arrested on suspicion of common assault against a security guard, possession of an offensive weapon, affray, possession of Class B drugs, and assault on an emergency worker." Now look, this woman may well not have conducted herself very well. However, the inciting incident was that an illegal immigrant with literal demon eyes invaded her home. And the police said, "You have not committed an arrestable offence. Go back to your luxury accommodation where you're being defended by security guards, also migrants paid for by the British taxpayer." The kind of taxpayer whose home they are invading. I mean, quite literally, they're invading our country, but individual homes. And then in this defence, they've treated it like, oh, she's got a short skirt, so she deserves it. Oh, she left her door open, so she deserves it. Actually, we should be living in the kind of high trust culture where you should, as we did before 1945, be able to leave your door unlocked in your homogenous neighbourhood, and you don't get all of your possessions stolen, and you don't just have random demon-eyed migrants walking in there. Like, we could just do that. Again, this man is only in our country because of government policy. He can be removed via government policy, and should. He should be very swiftly deported to keep women like this safe. But instead, the state thinks that this man, not this woman, is the victim. And do you know how we know this? Because even when they get arrested, even when they are convicted of crimes, even when they have committed heinous offences against women and girls, they do not get punished. We already remember I think it was the Eritrean man who committed a sexual attack on a girl with learning difficulties, who was given no more jail time because he'd been held on remand, and he was given a puny 14-month sentence. That's 20 months less than Lucy Conley and Peter Lynch, by the way, were given for a Facebook post, and he pled not guilty and was convicted, whereas they were encouraged to plead guilty by bad legal advice. But that guy, an illegal migrant who committed a sex offence, is now free. And this chap, Nigerian man here, he sexually assaulted a young woman in Bournemouth Beach, and he was spared prison by the judge because of his troubled background and difficult life. Okay, he has just inflicted unforgettable pain on this woman, made her life very difficult. I don't care how difficult his socioeconomic situation is. He is a depraved sexual pervert, and he should be deported, at the very least. And this is Ayomide Famakinde, and he was given a community order by the judge, who said his offence was a momentary aberration. Famakinde approached his 19-year-old victim late at night in the Dorset seaside town in August 2022, put his hands down her jogging bottoms, and then as they fell to the ground, he continued to try and assault her. The judge ruled his offence was a momentary aberration, and the defendant had a very troubled background and difficult life. Don't care. Shouldn't be here. But, yet again, the state thinks that he should. The state thinks that all of these men should be in our country. Because no matter how many crimes they commit to get into our country, or while they are housed at our expense, they think the criminals are the real victims. Thank you very much for watching. I will be back next week at the regularly scheduled time. Thank you for all of the super thanks that people have sent in, the likes of Sad Wings, Raging, and other viewers. No matter how small they are, they're always appreciated. Thank you for sharing the content and making the channel so far a roaring and unexpected success. I will be away for a few weeks as of next weekend, but there should be a pre-recorded speech that is coming out that I delivered to the Family Education Trust that should be of interest to a few of you, and when I return from the likes of NatCon DC and reappearing on Timcast, I might have some dispatches from my time in foreign lands to share. Until then, take care and goodbye.